All right. Hello, everyone. I want to thank everyone so much for joining us this evening. This is Left Bank Books, the Environmental Studies program at Washington University, National Parks Conservation Association, and the St. Louis Regional Chapter of the Als Association. Welcome the friends and family of Michael J. Yochim, who will discuss his last work and the work he dedicated his life to, Requiem for America's Best Idea, National Parks in the Era of Climate Change. This event will feature a conversation between some of Michael's friends and family to celebrate this posthumously published book. Left Bank Books is St. Louis's oldest independent bookstore. We would like to thank all of our supporters, the supporters of Mike, and everyone for their outpouring of love for our bookstore. We offer in-store shopping, curbside pickup, and delivery to anywhere in the country, anywhere in the world even. We are happy to be able to bring our event series virtual. We believe that events are a way to expand your mind and bring in new thoughts to make the world a better place. We hope that you enjoy this event, and we hope that you support Left Bank Books by purchasing a copy of the book for you or for all of your friends on our website at left-bank.com. Purchasing a copy of the book from Left Bank Books allows us to keep our bookstore and staff operating. We offer shipping options to anywhere in the country, so we thank you so much for your support. I am Shane Mullen. I'm the events coordinator for Left Bank Books. We help produce hundreds of author events each year with a fantastic team here in St. Louis. We will be taking questions from you, the audience, at the end of the event, so please type your questions as a comment. And be sure to follow Left Bank Books on Facebook and YouTube to be notified about all of our fantastic virtual events. I want to thank our co-sponsors for the evening, and I will briefly mention a little bio about them. Washington University's Environmental Studies program works to understand the systems that shape the Earth's environment and how they influence the planet's diverse ecosystems, our natural resources, the communities we live in, and local and global political systems. National Parks Conservation Association is the voice of America's national parks, working to protect and preserve our nation's most iconic and inspirational places for present and future generations. From the national headquarters in Washington, D.C. and 27 locations nationwide, NPCA calls on program and policy experts, committed volunteers, staff lobbyists, community organizers, and communications specialists to inform and inspire the public and to influence decision makers to ensure that our national parks are well protected. The St. Louis Regional Chapter of the Als Association improves the lives of people living with ALS, the progressive neurodegenerative disease known as Lou Gehrig's disease, in eastern Missouri and in central and southern Illinois through services and education. About tonight's book, Requiem for America's Best Idea. In his enthusiastic explorations and fervent writing, Michael J. Yochim was to Yellowstone what Muir was to Yosemite. Other times, his writing is like that of Edward Abbey, full of passion for the natural world and anger at those who are abusing it, writes forward contributor William R. Lowry. In 2013, Yochim was diagnosed with ALS, Lou Gehrig's disease. While fighting the disease, he wrote Requiem for America's Best Idea. The book establishes a unique parallel between Yochim's personal struggle with a terminal illness and the impact climate change is having on the national parks, the treasured wilderness that he loved and to which he dedicated his life. Yochim explains how climate change is already impacting the vegetation, wildlife, and the natural conditions in Olympic, Grand Canyon, Glacier, Yellowstone, and Yosemite National Parks. A poignant and thought-provoking work, Requiem for America's Best Idea investigates the interactions between people and nature and the world that can inspire and destroy them. Michael J. Yochim, 1966 to 2020, worked for 20 years at Yellowstone National Park, as well as at Yosemite, Grand Canyon, and Sequoia. His books include Yellowstone and the Snowmobile, Locking Horns Over National Park Use, A Week in Yellowstone's Thoroughfare, A Journey Through the Remotest Place, Essential Yellowstone, A Landscape of Memory and Wonder, and Protecting Yellowstone, Science and the Politics of National Park Management. And now, if you would please help me in warmly welcoming our guests for the evening, I will bring them all onto the screen. Hello, here everyone is. We have an incredible crowd here watching this evening. I'm going to turn this over to you, Bill.
All right, thanks very much, Shane. And thanks to Left Bank Books for hosting this event. Really do appreciate it. You guys are an excellent bookstore, and we're proud to be part of it. I also want to thank everybody that's online, and I do want to express our gratitude as panelists for the co-sponsors that you mentioned already, NPCA, the ALS Society, and my good friends over at Washington University. I'll be very brief in my introductory comments. I've had numerous chances to already speak or write about Mike's book, including earlier today on St. Louis Local Public Radio, and I thank them for that. And I want to make sure that we have enough time for the panelists to say their piece too. So again, I'm going to be very brief, but I do want to make 3 quick points. The first is, if you don't know anything about this book, and Shane just gave a pretty good introduction to it, but this is a remarkable book because it's actually 2 books in one. One book is about climate change affecting national parks. The other book is about the author's struggle with ALS as he tried to explain that situation, and to the point where Mike wrote this book entirely with his eyes. And he was just so dedicated to the national parks that he was determined to get this finished. And it makes for an amazing combination. To me, it's a unique book, and it's a very compelling book. And Mike, there's a line in the book there where Mike says, if we're not careful, my experience will be the universal experience. In other words, other people will not be able to enjoy the parks just as he couldn't in the latter part of his life because he was fighting with ALS. So that's a brief introduction to the book. The second introduction is, I guess to me, and just as we all know, the author can't be with us tonight because Mike passed away Leap Day of 2020, a rare day for a rare individual. Mike was very realistic, and he knew he might not be able to finish this book. And so about 6 months before he died, he asked me that in the event that he was not able to finish it, if I would make sure that it got done. And Mike and I have known each other. We'd known each other for a long time. We were friends, co-authors. Mike almost finished it. He finished all the research and nearly all the writing, but we still had to get it published. And with the help of the people on this panel and their families, the University of New Mexico Press, and especially Mike's parents, who did so much for him in the latter part of his life, we got it done. And I think all of us on this panel are very proud of this book and very happy to have the occasion to speak about it. Okay, third point, just how is this panel going to proceed? Okay, I'm the moderator, which means I have one duty that I'm not crazy about, but that is keeping track of time that everybody is speaking. Where we're going to go, we're going to do this is each panelist is going to talk about 4 or 5 minutes about Mike and some aspect of the book that they want to. And we want to make sure we have some time left at the end for question and answer. So I'm going to keep track of time, and I've already warned the panelists that when my clock goes off at 4 minutes, I'm going to warn them they have a minute left. So those are the ground rules. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to you. Oh, one other point. We're going to go in chronological order of when people on the panel got to know Mike. So that we start with Mike's twin brother, Jim, and then we'll go to his younger brother, Brian, and then we'll go to Eric, who met Mike in graduate school, and then we'll go to Michelle, who was such a good friend to Mike in the last few years of his life. So, Jimmy, I'm turning it over to you.
Thank you, everybody, for joining. My name is Jim Yochim. I'm Mike's twin brother, so as default, I've known him the longest. Joining us on the panel are some very good friends of ours, of Mike's. One of the silver linings to ALS is I got to meet Eric, Bill, and Michelle, some great people. I grew up in St. Louis, graduated from University of Missouri, St. Louis here. I've worked for the Department of Labor for over 30 years. I'm married to my lovely wife, Nora, and we raised a son, Matthew, who lives in West Lafayette, Indiana. I currently work in St. Louis. Mike and I are the product of Catholic education here in St. Louis. In 2012, I had the opportunity to fly out to visit Mike for our 46th birthday. And he lived in Mariposa, California at the time, right outside of Yosemite. And we got to spend a nice week together. Brian and his lovely wife joined us in the park for a nice dinner on our birthday. The following year, about February or March, Mike, back up a little bit, Mike and I would talk about once a month. He'd generally initiate the calls, and starting about February, March, he started to say that his speech would get slurred in the evening, and I would say, I don't really notice it, Mike. And then later in the year, he started to say that his muscles were twitching. And lo and behold, on Friday, September 13th, 2013, he received the very bad news that he was diagnosed with ALS. Later that year, he asked that I join him on one of his bucket list items, in a raft ride with the commercial outfitter on the Colorado River through the Grand Canyon. And that became a family affair. I joined him on the first half of the ride and met him in Flagstaff, Arizona. That day, my brother Paul took the second half of the raft ride. Brian met him back up in Flagstaff and brought him up to Wyoming, where he joined my parents at his house. Earlier that in 2014, he had gone to our house and visited, and he was walking fine. And when I met him in Flagstaff, his walking gait had definitely changed. A little bit of the climate change. It's early May after a very cold winter in the Midwest, and it snowed in Flagstaff that night. And I'm like, oh my gosh, what we get ourselves into. But he and I had a wonderful experience on the Colorado River. Actually saw a lot of wildlife down there, birds, coyotes, cacti. With his condition, we had to help him with setting up the tent and packing his belongings and setting up the camp. He knew in the morning when the coffee call was made that I would typically drop everything and get my morning cup of coffee. So he knew to stay out of my way when I ran and got the cup of coffee. We rode these big yellow rafts, and he sat in the middle up front with me on his left and somebody else on his right. He still had a very solid grip, and we were able to navigate the waterfalls that periodically came on the Colorado River. One of my most favorite memories of that trip was one evening, and I don't remember the name of the place we were camping at, but it was a very peaceful, nice, warm evening. The rest of the group went off on a hike somewhere, and Mike and I just sat on the riverbank, the sand beach, watching life go by, the river flowing by, and the sun setting on the red canyon wall across from the river. Everybody on the raft ride was great, pitching in to help me with him and helping him as well. And at my disembarkment point was Phantom Ranch, the halfway point. And my brother Paul had hiked down to the canyon, and he took over from there. I had walked up to the bunkhouse at Phantom Ranch as to find out where I was going to be sleeping that night. Turned around, and here's my brother Mike hiking or walking up from the river, which was quite a struggle for him with his ski poles just to say goodbye once again. And we enjoyed some lemonade there on the porch. That fall, he moved back home. The silver lining there was I was able to see him a lot more often than I had in the previous number of years, because he was out working in his favorite places like Yellowstone and Yosemite and the Grand Canyon. We got to relive a lot of memories from our childhood and growing up. It was a pleasure for me to help him out in that regard. So I'll never forget.
All right, maybe you should probably wrap it up.
Thank you for your time. Appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks very much. Sorry to interrupt.
No problem.
Brian?
Hi, everybody. I'm Brian Yoakam. I'm Michael's younger brother, and I work as a neuropsychologist. Like Mike, I've written several books, and he and I worked in two very different areas, but it was such a pleasure to spend a lot of time working on his book and working with Bill to get it published. I'm really grateful to Bill and the Left Bank Books for hosting this event, and grateful for all of you for attending. So in 2010, I moved to California, and before starting my job, Mike took me on a backpacking trip through Yosemite National Park. I told Mike that, based on prior experience, I really could only hike 6, maybe 7 miles per day on hard Sierra Nevada trails with a heavy backpack. And so in classic Mike form, he thereby planned for us to hike 10 miles per day. But also in classic Mike form, he knew I was able to do it and empowered me to hike 50 miles of Yosemite backcountry in 5 days. And of course, he prepared delicious dinners in the backcountry over his one-burner stove. You'll hear more about that in a little bit. Just a short time later, in 2014, I was hiking with Mike, again in Yosemite, and he needed help with something that he never needed help with before. He asked if I could tie his boot laces. His ability to tie his shoes was one of the first skills he lost to ALS, and his book depicts how the disease eventually played out without ever affecting his sharp mind. And more on that soon. I've been a frequent visitor to Yosemite since I first lived in California in 2003, and the effects of climate change are visible to anyone who can look out their window at the surrounding landscape. As one drives into the west side of the park, they are surrounded by a landscape that has burned at least once since my first visit in 2003. Since I first lived there, wildfires have become an established part of the summer months, coloring the skies red. Likewise, as one walks around the beloved Yosemite Valley, it is easy to notice the high number of dead trees. A visitor may think that this may be normal, but the rates of trees dying in California has increased rapidly in the past 10 years. Just last year, in 2021, 9.5 million trees in California died from insects, disease, and dehydration, which are all made worse by our changing climate. We should all reflect on our roles in causing this. We're all responsible for this to some degree, but that same power to cause this can also enable individuals to contribute to decreasing climate change. For example, I want to point out that my parents installed solar panels on their house, even though they may not live long enough to come out ahead financially. Just like Mike empowered me to hike 50 miles through the Yosemite wilderness, he's empowering us to do our share to combat climate change. It's time we all do our share to repair the damage we've all done to this planet that we're passing on to the next generation. We all know Mike did his share to reduce the effects of American-caused climate change. While it can be easy to give up when faced with the challenges of ALS, Mike chose to use his remaining time to make lasting contributions to the world. He spent many days, with the help of our parents, performing research and writing this book, all without the use of his hand. In my profession as a neuropsychologist, one who evaluates people's cognitive abilities, I found myself amazed by Mike's cognitive skills as a writer. A friend mentioned to me that Mike must have kept a good journal of his hikes over the years because he described them so clearly years afterward. But I don't think he actually kept a journal of his hikes. I think his memories of his hiking journeys were so clear and so powerful that he was easily able to recall them when writing years later. Another facet of Mike's writing is what we psychologists call working memory. When most of us are writing, we have a thought in our minds and are able to type it into a document within seconds, in less time than it took for me to say this. We can write a few sentences to explain a concept in a minute. When Mike wrote his book, though, he had to use eye tracking software to get his thoughts out. That is, he came up, I heard the timer, Bill.
1 minute. Thanks, Brian.
Sure. He came up with one of his beautiful sentences contained in this book and had to hold it in his mind for a very long time to commit it to print. He could have a paragraph composed in his mind, but it could take him an hour to type it. This is something perhaps no other writer in the world has had to struggle with, and I wanted to point this out tonight. Not only was his writing beautiful, but the cognitive challenge of holding on to these thoughts while slowly typing out each letter is an amazing accomplishment in itself. So thank you for letting me join this panel, and thanks for attending.
Thanks, Brian. Eric?
I'm Eric Compas. I'm one of Mike's many friends that has done some backcountry trips with him. We had parallel paths. We both grew up in St. Louis. We both ended up falling in love with Yellowstone. We both worked there. And oddly enough, we both ended up at the same PhD program at the University of Wisconsin-Madison and both wrote dissertations on Yellowstone. And got to know each other only when we ended up in the same grad school program, and found out that we both like backpacking. And once Mike knows that you're interested and available to go backpacking, you're on his list. And so every January, I would get a call or an email talking about, what are we gonna do this summer? We need to figure it out. We need to, make plans soon. And the best thing with Mike was to go along with whatever he came up with. Like I was married, had 2 kids. I didn't know what was going to happen, 6-8 months from now. But he had every week planned and exactly where we were going to go hiking. And I ended up on a lot of adventures with him in some incredible places. And you knew they were always going to be incredible hikes. Like Brian said, you always ended up walking much further than you thought you were going to. You also, when he mentioned food on the backcountry trip, you let him do all the meal planning and say, all right, what else could I do? I had never eaten pine nuts before in my life until I was in the Yellowstone backcountry. And I kid you not, this is the meal. It was sun-dried tomato tortellini pasta with a cream sauce. And then the pine nuts were the garnish on top of that. I don't eat that well at home. And so the backcountry was incredible. And I guess the glimpse into Mike in his life is that he was this, he was a mountain man, and he was really tough, really rugged. All these places that he talks about, he went to at least one, if not twice, if not 3 times, and spent an incredible amount of time in these places that he talks about in his book. And so a mountain man, a National Park Service interpretive ranger, and the detail and depth of an academic, and makes him an incredible storyteller. And when he tells a story about Yellowstone, a place that I know well and spent a lot of time with him, that's a tough chapter to read. There were several places that Mike and I ended up where we could stand and look around. Often this was on promontories or on mountain peaks, and not see a single human structure within our visage. And to kind of feel that sense of wonder, it's a little bit of fear of how am I going to get out of here, and beauty. And and I think in his chapter he does an incredible job of capturing that view of Yellowstone, the wildness and the beauty of it. And so when he turns to climate change, and I've read some of the papers that Mike uses within that chapter. I've never read an academic study and actually hoped and prayed that it was wrong, because the projections for Yellowstone with climate change, fire has always been a part of Yellowstone's history. And with climate change, it potentially means that Yellowstone that's radically different than the one that Mike and I know, that other people know, and what it would mean for the future. And I think as he writes about it, he kind of gives us a glimpse through his lens of ALS, that he saw these minute changes to himself. And he's taken that same perspective on Yellowstone, and that these minute changes, he actually goes back and looks at some of the trips and things that we think of as being kind of a natural changes. He takes as those first indications of what climate change could mean for the park, and kind of highlights that for the rest of us, that we've got a moment. Yellowstone will still be on the map. The Grand Canyon's not going to evaporate with climate change, but we need to do something now, and we have an opportunity now. And I feel like Mike has given us that picture and that opportunity to make a difference, so these parks stay some semblance of what we've experienced, and hopefully others will too. Thank you.
Perfect. Thanks, Eric. Michelle?
Hi there. I'm Michelle Reynolds Gray. I considered Mike to be my best friend. I think that he considered many people to be his best friends. And he was a good friend to many, and so many of those people came back to visit him for years, right up until his death. came from all over the country and multiple times and visited him. And that was a true testimony to the kind of person he was, the kind of friend he was. I have volunteered with 4 people with ALS, Mike being the last. I've also worked for the Als Association, St. Louis Regional Chapter. They were very good to Mike through his illness and took care of many things for he and his family. I currently own a cafe and coffee shop in Bourbon, Missouri, and I'm near the Ozark Trail and situated to get back in the woods. I met Mike in 2015. He needed help writing the book he was currently writing. He needed help with his photos, and he couldn't use his hands. He had his photos in a shoebox, in several shoeboxes, and so we would get the shoebox out, and I would hold the photo up, and he would raise his eyebrows for, yes, it's a possibility that he might use that photo in the book, and he would look down if it would be a no. Most of the time it was looking down, but sometimes we'd turn the photo over and turn it up in the shoebox, and then we'd go back through those later when he was making the final selections. But through doing that, it changed my life because I got to see these beautiful places that he had photographed and captioned so carefully. He captioned each photo with a date and where it was and a little bit about it. And I got interested myself in backpacking, and he mentored me, and I went on to become a backpacker. For Christmas in 2016, he gifted me his favorite backpacking stove, and it had been through so many of his travels and trips. And with tears in his eyes, he knew that he would never get to use it again. But he gave that to me. He taught me how to be a backcountry cook, and I got pretty good at it. And I'm known in my hiking circles to make the best food. And so I owe that to Mike for sure. When he was writing any of the books that I saw him write, he gave full dedication to that. It didn't matter if it were, a beautiful day outside and he could sit outside, and maybe tomorrow was going to be a rainy day and he wouldn't get to. But if he had chosen today as a day to research or write something, toward his book, he would not waver with that. There seemed to be a different urgency with this book, even more urgency. He knew his time was coming to an end, but I also think he just knew this was such an important book. He just wanted to get it finished and, have something for future generations. He just wanted to make a difference. Mike was a talented writer, and if you haven't purchased the book, please do. He could describe things in a way that few can. He would describe them where you can just picture exactly what he is saying, and you want to go there and see that that place. But you really could get an idea of whatever he was describing, and just a full picture in your mind. I think it's rare to be able to do that without it. The book is beautiful. It has beautiful photos, but even without those photos, you would be able to get a good idea and image in your mind. So I'm really proud of Mike. Hope you get the book and share it with your friends. And thank you so much for joining us tonight.
Thank you, Michelle. Thanks, all of you. And those are very nice comments from all 4 of you. And I think I'm going to turn it back over to Shane here in a second to talk about question and answer. I guess I just wanted to comment that Mike obviously touched all of us very deeply, and he changed all of our lives, which is fascinating. I think you used that line, Michelle. You said he changed my life, and he changed all of our lives. My wife Lynn and I would go out to visit he and his folks, and he kept his sense of humor all the way until the end, which was quite remarkable. And every time after we left the house and we were driving home, we'd look at each other and say, we don't have any problems. we don't have any complaints. I mean, if this guy can have a sense of humor, even when he's dealing with what he's dealing with, then we shouldn't be complaining about trivial things. He was a remarkable person that way. And I think he really did affect all of us quite deeply. And I think when you read this book, you're going to get a sense of that. People will get a sense that this was quite an amazing guy, and it's an incredible story. And as you said, Michelle, it's going to make you want to go out for a hike in a park, if nothing else.
Yes.
Remarkable writer. Shane, I'm happy to turn it back over to you if you have questions that you wanted to pass along to the board.
I will encourage the audience to type up questions because we do have quite a bit of time for audience questions now. And we don't have any questions yet, but Charlie said that they heard the St. Louis Public Radio coverage today, which I was too busy today to tune in, but I'm really excited to listen to that here in a little bit. I do also want to apologize for mispronouncing many of your last names. So Mike Yoakam. I have been corrected both on from someone watching tonight. So I do want to apologize for that. And we've been talking about this event so much at the store that I just had this pronunciation in my head of how it was pronounced. So, but Stephanie says, love hearing the story. Sally says, what an amazing man. I wish I had known him. I am enjoying this book very much. So
that's great to hear. Shane, I also wanted to mention, and I think this is a real indication of how gracious Mike's parents are, who are online as well. The proceeds from the sales of this book, anything that they were going to get, is going back to fight against ALS. That tells you something. That tells you a lot right there. And ALS we need to fight ALS. It's a terrible disease. I didn't know anything about ALS until it happened to Mike. And the more I learned about it, the harder it was. I mean, it's just the stories in this book about people that were suffering from ALS are quite remarkable. And Michelle, I'm sure you could tell many of those stories. It's just tragic what people have to deal with. Basically, if the people in the audience don't know much about ALS, I'm happy to turn it over to you. But it's a neurological disorder that makes it impossible for the body to function, except, and like in Mike's case, the only thing he could use were his eyes. And otherwise, the brain stays very active. So it's incredibly claustrophobic, if nothing else. And Mike, he just didn't complain. But, when you learn about ALS, you realize this is just a tragic disease. And I wish I could say that we're getting closer to a cure, but as far as I know, we're not. I don't know if that's correct or not. Michelle, maybe you want to jump in on that?
I think we will see a cure, I hope, in our lifetime. There's a whole lot of research since the Ice Bucket Challenge several years ago that really changed the course of the research that was able to be done. And so much is happening. Right now. And I do feel like we will see, we're making progress. We're making progress in slowing the disease down with some patients, with some people with ALS. But no, there's not a cure, and there needs to be.
Michelle, someone asked in the audience if there was a website for the St. Louis ALS chapter. Do you have that?
Yes. It's ALSA, ALSA, STL.com.
All right. I'm sharing that in the chat as well.
It's a truly wonderful organization. They provided unbelievable amount of support for Mike and my parents with equipment, medicine, nourishment. So it's a great organization, and your money will be well worth it if you decide to contribute to it.
We do have several. Oh, sorry. We have several audience questions strolling in, but I wanted to ask my own that to kick off while some more questions are typed up. Are any of you, or are there plans to help continue Mike's mission with either writing or continuing the conservation efforts that he did during his lifetime? Who is, maybe not if one of you, is there someone that is kind of taking that and furthering it?
I'm happy to take a first stab at that. So I am retired as of a year ago, but I'm still writing, and I'm now trying to write, of all things, some fiction on the impacts of climate change on the world. And so it's something I care about deeply, and I think it's an existential threat to the world, and I think we all should care about it, and we shall all be doing something about it. I will say, and it's not just because they co-sponsored this event, but the NPCA is a great organization for helping the parks and their efforts to try and deal with climate change in the parks. The fact of the matter is the parks can only do so much on their own, and we need the world, we need our country, and we need the world to address climate change. Parks are just islands, and they're going to be affected by climate change everywhere. So if nothing else, I hope people that are online or listening right now are in touch with their members of Congress and saying, you need to act. They need to act now.
Rebecca, oh, sorry.
Can I just add to that? I think it's all of our responsibilities to continue Mike's legacy of doing what we can to combat climate change. Americans produce more air pollution per capita than any other country in the world, so I think we need to step up and take responsibility for fixing the mess we created.
Yeah, I mean, I think, one of the things that Mike highlights about national parks is that we tend to, when we talk about climate change, talk about the adaptation options that we have that are, all right, if it gets increased flooding, that we can put up, flood barriers and things like that. So for the human places we live in, we feel like we have solutions to. But when it comes to national parks, it's the wildness, the remoteness, the lack of human influence that's almost impossible to maintain with climate change. And so they're vulnerable in a way that the rest of our human spaces aren't. And so I think we're back to fundamentally solving it as a planet in order to do the minimal damage. We still have a lot of latitude. As Mike says in his book, a lot of his projections are based upon the worst case scenario. And that if we, through the Paris Climate Accord, other global mechanisms, can avoid that, then we've done an incredible service to national parks.
That's one of the points that Mike made in the book so well, is that he was affected by a terminal disease and he could not stop it. The parks are threatened by a terminal disease, but we could stop it. So I think you're exactly right, Eric.
Rebecca says, this is such an incredible book, and asks, what do you think Mike would wish as an action step that we could take to protect our parks? So maybe like one or two really actionable things for our audience to help out with.
Mike mentions a program that the Park Service has, the Climate Change Conservation Program, and I don't know that it gets as much attention or support as it should. And again, and maybe because I'm a political scientist, I tend to fall back on telling your members of Congress to try and support these kinds of things, these efforts in the parks. Somebody else has one more specific than that in mind. I'll try and think about, I do. There's one that comes to mind right away, and that is that in the park, some parks have made the change from allowing everybody to drive their vehicles into the park to having people ride buses once they get into the park, particularly electric buses, like in Zion. And I think that's a great change. That would be a very good thing to happen in the national parks.
I think reading the book.
Go ahead, Eric.
Reading the book, and I think Mike, all of us are so busy in our lives that we let some of these tiny changes accumulate until we realize that, all right, it's too late. And so I think let Mike be our what ironically are the eyes and legs for us for traveling to these places and learning that, all right, before changes get too far, are too substantial, or we don't hit that point where we say it's too late. I think that reading the book, learning about what's going on, there are specific organizations for each park, but I think the most important thing that Mike would say is we need a global response. And that starts with us voting with climate change in mind, writing our legislators with climate change in mind, and making it a national and global issue in a way that it just hasn't made it to yet.
I remember when Mike bought his first Prius, and he was such an avid outdoors person. People think you need an SUV to go enjoy the outdoors, but he saw more of the outdoors than anyone else I know, and his 45 miles per gallon car worked just fine for that. And I would also encourage everyone to vote in ways that help climate change.
Does anyone else have a response before I? Okay. So Crystal is asking for any and all panelists, I think this includes Dad, really looking forward to reading my copy. Is there a section of the book that was Mike's favorite or your favorite?
Good question.
I would have to say it would have been the chapter on Yellowstone. He definitely loved that park. And it shows in the writing of that chapter. I could tell he's most knowledgeable of that intimately. He hiked literally every trail in that park. As Eric said, maybe once, maybe twice, maybe 3 times. And you could visibly see climate changes there in the park. One of his first seasons out there was in 1988 when the last huge catastrophic fire was there. And he had to evacuate the park towards the end of August or September. And a couple years later, when my wife and I were there, he was guiding a ranger-led hike that talked about his experiences that year. And then one of the paragraphs in that chapter, he was hiking with somebody, and he could see the smoke off in the horizon. And that was just one of the starts of that catastrophic year of fires. The number of pine trees that are dying out there because of the pine bark beetle, because of the warmer winters don't kill off those bugs. They'd only take 1 year to rejuvenate themselves, or so instead of the 2 years. So the trees are suffering. So I will stop there.
I think you're right, Jim, but I think you're also being modest, because I have to say one of my favorite parts of the book was the description of the trip he took in the Grand Canyon with you. And it's really quite a story, because Mike was really worried that he was going to be a guys on people on the trip, because he couldn't. It was hard for him to get in and out of the boat even, and you were helping him with that. But I don't know, maybe I'm giving away the punchline. Spoiler alert. But by the end of the trip, Mike was anything but a burden. Everybody was so happy that he was along on the trip. It's really quite a remarkable story. And it says something about the way people help each other out that I think is really quite profound.
So I flew into Phoenix and took a shuttle bus up to Flagstaff and sat next to a gentleman who just so happened he was also going to be on that raft ride, and his name is Bob Gray. And my last day on the river, a couple of evenings before my favorite evening with Mike, he also stayed behind on that hike and joined us for a nice cold beer on the river. And I had asked him before my brother Paul took over, can you help Paul this evening? He doesn't know the ropes or the routine yet. And not only did he help that evening, he helped the entire rest of the trip. And Mike has a way of growing on people. And so much so that Bob Gray made 2 trips down from Michigan to visit Mike. So
I want to say that the incident with the canyon wren in the Grand Canyon chapter, and then the house wren that landed on his finger here, were very memorable for him.
I think my favorite chapter was the Yosemite chapter, and when Mike was working out there, my wife and I lived out there also, and we had our child around that time. And I remember Mike seeing us one night, and hey, I'm going to take this trip where I ski across Yosemite National Park. A plane's going to fly us over, and we're going to ski across. And we thought, what? You're going to ski across the whole park? That's amazing. And now he wrote about it in this book. And it was neat to see his description of it. And it was neat for me as Bill and I were working on the book. I was the one who found the photos in Mike's computer, and it was such a joy to find the photos matching the descriptions he had written in the book. He had labeled all the photos so well in his computer, so I was so glad I was able to find the photos corresponding to what he was describing in the book.
Did you have her? All right. So Richard MK, and I think this might be a good question for you, Michelle. If Mike could give me a piece of advice on being a responsible steward when I'm in the wilderness, what guidance do you think he'd share? And as someone who is getting into, my partner is very into hiking, and I'm going to go on some of my first down in your area, Michelle. So I'm wondering, what can we do when we are in the wilderness to be good stewards?
I don't know if this exactly applies to good stewardship, but I do know Mike was very much about slowing down and enjoying the hike and not rushing through it, which I think that's being a good steward of the beautiful land that we have, appreciating it and sharing it with others. But he was not into, what did he call them? Death marches, when people would just, rush right through because they wanted high mileage, or but they didn't get to enjoy, get to see the beauty in it. And that was just one thing that, came to mind when you asked that. Anybody else as far as good stewardship?
It's a great answer. Eric, do you want to pick up on that? You spent a lot of time with him in the wilderness.
Yeah, I mean, nowadays we have these leave no trace ethics and kind of these rules. And, I think Mike was one of these people that practiced that and more from the get-go. And that, we always, when we were out in the backcountry, made sure that we left as little of trace, besides our footprints and taking pictures and so forth. He also, I mentioned, and Michelle mentioned this too, that Mike had many friends. I think part of his stewardship were taking people out to places and getting them to see these places. So taking a friend out that has never been to one of these places. The reason we protect national parks is because a lot of people love them. And I recall a specific story. He took me and my son's first backpacking trip, which was 6 days across the northern part of the Yellowstone wilderness. It was not an easy first introduction, and I thought maybe my son would never put on a backpack again. And as far as I know, right now he's somewhere in the Colorado backcountry. So certainly didn't help him.
That same thing happened with me. Not only did he influence me to backpack, and I'm an accomplished backpacker now, but my daughter and her husband, I mean, it just would not have happened without Mike. And the joy that he got from when we came back with our stories and photos and videos, he just loved it. And he loved being able to share that with other people, with my family.
I'd agree with Eric about leaving no trace, how Mike embraced that early on, and also just as a philosophy in life too. Trying to, make a mess, clean it up, only leave positive things behind. And I think another bit of advice I would give is to soak up the experience with all of your senses. Not just getting the exercise, but and not just enjoying the views, but enjoy the smells of the fresh air and the pine needles on a hot day. And enjoy the sound or the lack of sound, which Mike has talked about in his writing before, how just hearing absolute silence is very rare, and it's very hard to come by these days. So I think he would encourage all of us to really embrace it all with all of our senses and soak up the experience.
All right. I want to, first off, before, I think this might be our, well, we might have time for more questions. But there are some really incredible comments in the chat of people sharing their own stories with Mike, people sharing experiences in the wilderness, sharing ways to get politically active as well, and how to help combat climate change. So I think that there are some really incredible comments that I want to share with all the panelists as well after the event. And if you are watching on YouTube, check out the event on Facebook for some of the comments, and vice versa, because there are some amazing comments going on back and forth. So let's, we do have a couple of good questions. I mean, a lot of really good questions, and I wish I could share all the comments as well. But let's get to John's question. John asks, did Michael have one specific park and one special location within that park that was his favorite or special view or location to visit that we might visit and see it through Michael's eyes?
Take it away, Michelle.
Well, he did, but it's not as easy as you would think to get to. So he loved Yellowstone National Park, and that was his, love, and where his first memory was at Yellowstone when his father lost his sunglasses over the lower falls, and it was just where he felt he belonged. The specific place would be Yellowstone's thoroughfare, which is it's the most remote place in the lower 48. It is in the southern southeast part of Yellowstone, and not easy to get to. So a few of us did a memorial trip after Mike passed away, and we journeyed there, and it was quite a journey. First took a boat across Yellowstone Lake with our canoes and our gear. Then we canoed for a couple days, and then we hiked for a couple days, and just had quite a journey to get to this place that Mike loved, for the wildness, for the, as Brian mentioned, the lack of noise, the lack of motors. He loved the thoroughfare of Yellowstone, and it's amazing. I cannot describe it in words, but yeah, if you ever get a chance to see it, you should.
Wait. Now say it again.
Oh, I want to point out that Eric has been to the thoroughfare with Michael at least once, maybe more. I don't know, twice. Okay. Yeah. So, and I'd like to say that I'm Michael's mom, and I'd like to say that he had a way of encouraging you to take a longer hike than what you thought you were capable of. I'm a prime example of that. He would, we go, well, we've been there many times, and he always had hikes lined up for us that he would like to take us on that we never would have gone on by ourselves. So we saw scenery that a lot of people had never seen. And I would look at it and I say, oh, I don't know if I can do that many miles, Mike. And he'd come up and pat me on the shoulder. Mom, you can do it. I know you can. So, okay. and we did it. And it was always a great experience. People will go on a hike and they can look at the beauty of the mountains and the trees and the creeks. And he would look at that, but he would also stop and bend over and look at tiny wildflowers or pick up pine cones or all these little things that I would have walked right past. So that's all.
Crystal asks, do you think Mike's relationship with the parks changed after his diagnosis?
he valued them
Well,
even
only
more.
in that he couldn't go hiking in them anymore, but they were still his love, just period.
He had
I
a
would-
remarkable memory of remembering so many details. He just had a remarkable memory.
And it was so helpful to him. He writes about one of the really sad anecdotes in the book is about a woman that had ALS, and to the point where she couldn't even open her eyes. And Mike, he felt so bad for her because he wondered, what does she fall back on when she's by herself and she just has to think? She can't. What does she think about? And for him, he could think about the parks and he would remember his experiences there, and they were really important to him. And that was one of the reasons that he wanted to get this book out, so that other people would say, we got to save these places so that people have those experiences they can fall back on.
Someone mentioned and I wonder if someone could tell maybe a little bit more about the story, but Janet mentions the bucket list trip to Glacier National Park.
Yes.
And I wonder if someone can tell more about that story while we have a little bit more time.
I'm not sure we can. He took it with Janet and her friends and family. They were very helpful in that regard, because at that point he had a lot of trouble walking. So they helped him see whatever they wanted to see in Glacier National Park. Yeah. And then
I think it was on his bucket list to go there one last time before he couldn't travel anymore.
And he
That's all I know.
had done like 17 trips to Glacier or something like
Oh,
that.
yeah. But he wanted to go one last time.
Yep.
Yeah.
He had a fabulous part in the book on that trip about described it almost as a symphony of the storm that came in when they were watching. I think it was at Goat Haunt.
Right.
And just the description of it was amazing, of the storm that came in on them.
Oh, yeah. He would go on a long hike or backpacking trip or even a day-long hike. And the next time we talked to him on the phone, he would just go into great detail about the things he saw, just detailed little things that he was just so enthused about.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
we learned after the fact, though, that he had encounters with moose and some bears and
Oh, yeah.
that we didn't hear about before.
Yeah.
And I remember
yeah.
telling him on one of our phone calls, Mike, don't share those kind of things with mom and dad. They don't need to know about the moose encounter.
Yeah.
I think we are about close to wrapping up. Would anyone like to share some last bits of wisdom, inspiration, a final story before we close out?
I'll steal a little of the thunder of one of the commenters, Sherry. I peeked in there, sorry. We can all do our own little bit to help the environment, even in our own backyard. Whether that's getting solar panels or growing a butterfly garden to help monarch butterflies, planting a tree. It all starts there.
And
I would say get out to one of those remote places, so like the thoroughfare. I mean, we talk about parks being loved to death right now, but most people don't venture more than at most a mile off the road. If you want an experience like Mike talks about, do one of those long hikes. Pick up a backpack, get out in some of these remote places where you might be a little bit scared, you might be a little bit nervous, you might encounter a moose or a grizzly bear, and that's what he would want you to. That's what he'd want you to see. Well, that's the national park that he loved.
I would just add, I don't think any of us want to preach to anybody, but just the lesson of Mike's life is worth remembering. He knew he didn't have much time left, and yet he was doing something that was beyond himself. He cared about things beyond himself, and he didn't worry about it. He wasn't hung up on that, and I think it's a great lesson for all of us to keep that in mind.
nobody would have blamed Mike if he had just spent the last few years of his life watching TV.
Or sitting on a beach or something. He didn't. He was determined to write this book.
No, he was determined.
And he couldn't have done it without our parents caring for him all those years. Thanks, Mom and Dad.
Well, I want to thank you all so much for this incredible evening. It really gave us all, some of us who never got to meet Mike, a really wonderful experience of hearing the stories and experiencing part of his life. I want to thank the audience for joining us this evening, and a reminder that we do have books available for sale at left-bank.com. They are available for pickup, for shipping anywhere in the country, anywhere in the world. We do offer international shipping as well. So if you're watching from wherever in the world, use this book as inspiration to kind of make change. And I want to thank all of our panelists tonight for being so giving with your time, with your stories, for sharing. Thank you.
Thank you, Shane. Thanks, to Left Bank Books.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Left Bank's Books.
Thanks, everyone, for attending.
All right. Have a good night, everyone. And we hope to see you again really soon.